It was a bright afternoon in London when former President Donald Trump, fresh off a busy day of meetings, decided to make a visit to Buckingham Palace. After a series of high-profile diplomatic talks, he thought a quiet stroll through one of the world's most famous landmarks would give him a break from the hectic schedule. Little did anyone know this innocent visit would soon turn into a memorable moment that would be talked about for days to come. Trump, known for his larger-than-life personality, had always enjoyed making his presence known wherever he went. His visits to foreign countries were often accompanied by a mix of awe, curiosity, and the occasional controversy. But Buckingham Palace, with its stunning gardens, historic buildings, and rich traditions, seemed like the perfect place for a more relaxed affair. He was in the middle of a brief pause in his schedule, walking across the sprawling grounds with a few of his closest aides, and taking in the iconic architecture. As they neared the palace's entrance, Trump was immediately struck by the sight of one of the most well-known figures of British tradition, a royal guard. These guards, dressed in their distinctive red uniforms, tall black hats, and stiff posture, had become almost as famous as the palace itself. They were symbols of stability, tradition, and strength, and Trump, always someone who enjoyed testing boundaries, couldn't resist. The guard stood tall and unmoving, positioned at his post in front of the palace gates, a sentinel who had clearly mastered the art of standing still for hours on end. The guard's focus was unwavering. His eyes were fixed ahead and his body was perfectly aligned with no sign of any movement. This was the Royal Guard's job, a job that had been carried out by countless men and women over the centuries. They were not there to entertain or acknowledge the public. They were there to protect and to serve, carrying out their duty with the utmost professionalism. Trump, however, couldn't help but feel a sense of amusement at the situation. The sight of the guard's absolute stillness caught his attention, and in typical Trump fashion, he saw it as an opportunity to make a statement, or perhaps even a joke. He walked up a few steps closer, clearly intrigued by the idea of interacting with the guard. "Hey you," Trump called out, his voice cutting through the otherwise quiet air. "What are you doing just standing there? You're making the place look empty." It was a harmless enough comment, and anyone who had seen Trump before would recognize that he wasn't trying to insult the guard, at least not directly. He was simply trying to break the ice to make things more informal. He had always been one to speak his mind, no matter where he was or who he was speaking to. However, the guard didn't react. He didn't flinch. He didn't move an inch. He didn't even acknowledge that Trump had spoken. The guard, as though he hadn't heard a word, continued to stand perfectly still in his posture, doing what he had been trained to do for years. It was as if Trump wasn't even there. Trump, undeterred by the lack of response, tried again. This time he raised his voice slightly, thinking that perhaps the guard hadn't heard him the first time. "I'm talking to you," he repeated a little louder. "You know, you don't need to be standing there so stiff. Relax, take a break." Still nothing. The guard remained motionless, his eyes still straight ahead, his body rigid. There was no sign of emotion on his face, no hint that he had even registered the words being thrown his way. Trump's aides, walking just a few steps behind him, exchanged nervous glances. They weren't sure what to make of the situation. On one hand, they knew how Trump loved to stir things up. On the other hand, they had never seen him act this way in front of the Royal Guard, an institution that had stood for centuries and was considered an essential part of British heritage. They had learned to stay quiet when these kinds of moments happened, knowing that their boss rarely liked to be ignored or dismissed, but the Royal Guard was not someone who could easily be swayed. His entire training and purpose were built on the foundation of discipline, respect for tradition, and commitment to the job, no matter who was standing in front of him. He was a symbol of stability, and that stability was not for sale, no matter how loud or confident the person in front of him was. Trump, feeling a bit more emboldened, leaned in closer to the guard. "All right then," he said with a smirk on his face. "You really think you're going to just stand there all day? I could probably get you fired if I wanted to." His words were delivered with the sort of humor that had become part of his public persona. Trump was known for his boldness, his directness, and sometimes his irreverence. He often joked around with people, and it was clear that he saw this encounter as another opportunity to make a memorable impression. But there was no response. The guard still didn't move, In that moment, something curious happened. Trump paused for a moment as though he had been struck by a thought. He took a step back and studied the guard more closely. It wasn't so much that he felt regret, but rather an acknowledgement of the steadfastness the guard was displaying. The guard wasn't responding to the jabs, the comments, or the humor. He wasn't there to entertain or be moved by the passing whims of the powerful. He was there to fulfill a role that had been part of British tradition for generations. Trump's usual swagger seemed to diminish just slightly, though he would never admit it. The lack of reaction from the guard had, in a way, thrown him off balance. He wasn't used to being ignored, especially in such a direct, almost silent manner, but the guard stood strong, unwavering in his commitment to his duty. It wasn't that he didn't care about the man standing in front of him. It was that his purpose, his position, and his role were more important than any individual moment or encounter. The air was thick with tension now. Those standing nearby were starting to sense the oddity of the situation. The former president of the United States, with all his power and influence, was facing off against a man who had none of that. The guard's power didn't come from his position in society. It came from his commitment to an ideal, the idea that some things, no matter who you are, must be respected and upheld. As the moments passed, a strange sort of silence fell between the two. Trump, no longer pushing the issue, simply turned away. It wasn't that he had been defeated, but rather that he had come to the realization that this was one battle he wasn't going to win. The Royal Guard, unyielding and unmoving, had made his statement. There was nothing more to say. Trump continued on his walk through the palace grounds, and the incident, though brief, would become part of a much larger story. A story not of confrontation, but of respect for tradition. A moment where the power of one man's presence met the unshakable strength of another's resolve. Trump was no stranger to power. As the former president of the United States, he had dealt with world leaders, public figures, and countless challenges. He was accustomed to people reacting to him, listening to him, and sometimes even trying to impress him. In many situations, he'd be the one giving orders, making decisions, and setting the tone. But as he walked away from the Royal Guard, something was gnawing at him, a sense of unresolved tension. He couldn't let it go. The fact that the guard had simply ignored him, standing so still and unmoved, rubbed Trump the wrong way. It wasn't just the fact that he'd been brushed off. It was that the guard seemed completely unaffected by the force of his personality. To Trump, this was unheard of. People usually responded to him. Even when they didn't agree with him, they responded. But this was different. The Royal Guard had shown no reaction, no sign of recognition. It was almost as if Trump's presence had no power at all in that moment. Trump's aides, walking behind him, noticed the shift in his demeanor. It wasn't a dramatic change, but they could tell something had sparked a thought inside him. They'd seen this before. It wasn't unusual for Trump to revisit a moment or an exchange, analyzing it again and again until he had it figured out in his own way. Well, that was interesting, Trump muttered to himself as though speaking to no one in particular. His aides exchanged brief glances but said nothing. They had learned that when Trump was in one of these moods, it was best to remain quiet and let him process things in his own time. Trump's thoughts began to race. He was used to being in control, used to having the ability to change the course of events simply by speaking. But here at Buckingham Palace, in front of a royal guard, he had learned something new. He wasn't the one in charge. The guard had not reacted, not even once, to his words or attempts to provoke a response. It wasn't just a man standing still. It was a symbol of unwavering tradition, and that was a power in itself. Trump couldn't help himself. He knew he was in a place where history, tradition, and authority were all deeply rooted in the very ground he was walking on. He had to do something about it. He couldn't let the moment slip by without trying again. After all, wasn't he the one who had always been the master of confrontation? Wasn't he the one who had dominated in situations like this before? "Let's go back," Trump suddenly said, a sharp edge to his voice. He stopped walking and turned to his aides, who looked surprised but said nothing. His mind was already set. He was going to revisit the Royal Guard, and this time, he would make sure that his presence would be acknowledged. There was no way he could just walk away from this moment and let it sit unresolved. As Trump turned around and began walking back toward the guard, his aides exchanged unsure glances. They understood that their boss didn't like to be challenged, especially when it came to something like this. But at the same time, They were curious to see how this would play out. The guard remained in position, completely unaware of Trump's decision to return. The stoic figure hadn't moved an inch since Trump had left, standing in the same spot, keeping his eyes forward, his posture as rigid as ever. It was as though the world around him could change. People could walk in and out, events could unfold. But his post remained the same. Trump came closer this time, his steps purposeful and determined. He wasn't going to let the guard's silence go unanswered. He was going to break the tension, force some sort of interaction. He had to. "Hey, I'm back," Trump called out as he neared the guard once again. This time his voice was louder, more insistent. "I'm serious. You're standing there like a statue and it's not helping. Move out of the way, I've got places to be." His words were casual, but there was a clear sense of authority behind them. Trump's natural leadership style was often marked by a directness that brooked no argument, and this time, he was laying it on thick. He expected a response. At the very least, he expected the guard to blink, shift his posture, or even acknowledge him in some way. But the royal guard stood unmoving, unfazed. Trump paused for a second, waiting for any sign that the guard might respond, but the man remained as still as ever. It was as though Trump had not spoken a word. It was frustrating for the former president. He tried again, raising his voice slightly. "I'm not kidding," Trump said, his words now more forceful. "If you don't move, I'm going to have to do something about this. You're making a fool of yourself." The words hung in the air, but the royal guard remained silent. The tension between the two figures was thickening. On one side, there was Trump, a man known for his ability to command attention who had been met with total resistance. On the other side, there was the guard, a figure whose entire existence was centered around discipline and respect for duty. The contrast between the two couldn't have been clearer. Trump's aides, standing off to the side, looked on in growing anxiety. They had never seen their boss behave in such a way, especially not with someone in a ceremonial position like this. But what could they say? They weren't in charge here, and they had learned long ago that when Trump decided to engage, there was little anyone could do to stop him. Trump, still determined to assert his authority, leaned forward slightly. "You know, I could have you fired right now. I'm sure I know people who can make that happen. Do you want that?" His voice was a mix of annoyance and a touch of humor, as if trying to lighten the situation with a joke. But the royal guard still did not budge. The only sounds that could be heard were the faint whispers of the crowd nearby, some of whom were watching in confusion, while others seemed to be silently enjoying the unusual spectacle that was unfolding before them. Despite his words, Trump knew deep down that there was something about this moment that was different. It wasn't like any of his usual encounters. The royal guard wasn't responding because he couldn't respond, not because he wasn't allowed to, but because his role was to serve, to stand, and to represent something much bigger than any individual interaction. It was a powerful lesson in humility, though one Trump would never openly admit to. As he stood there staring at the unmoving figure, something in Trump's posture softened, ever so slightly. He stepped back and glanced at his aides, who were now looking at him with a mix of uncertainty and curiosity. He said nothing at first, but his expression had changed. The tension that had once been sharp seemed to dull just a bit. Maybe, just maybe, the royal guard had won this round, and perhaps for the first time in a long while, Trump realized that sometimes authority wasn't about power or loud words, it was about silence and strength. With a final glance at the guard, Trump turned around. It wasn't the victory he had expected, but in some strange way it felt like one nonetheless. As Trump walked away from the royal guard for the second time, the quiet weight of the moment settled in. For a man who had spent much of his life being the center of attention, whether it was in a boardroom, a political rally, or on the world stage, this brief exchange with the royal guard had left him feeling strangely unsettled. The guard's complete lack of reaction had been a puzzle that Trump couldn't quite figure out. It wasn't the first time that Trump had encountered someone who didn't immediately bow to his influence, but there was something different about this situation. For most people, meeting a powerful figure like Trump would have sparked some kind of response, an acknowledgement, a handshake, or even just a shift in body language, but not the royal guard. The man had remained frozen, unmoved, and resolute in his position. There was no sign of recognition, no hint of hesitation, and certainly no hint of fear. It was as if the guard had been placed there not as a person, but as an immovable object, a part of the grand tradition that had endured for centuries. Trump couldn't stop thinking about it. As he made his way back inside the palace, he tried to shake off the feeling. He focused on the other matters at hand, meetings, discussions, and future plans. Yet every now and then his mind wandered back to that brief encounter with the royal guard. It was more than just a moment of personal frustration. It had become a reflection of something larger. He had tried in his own way to challenge the guard, and in doing so had unknowingly challenged an institution. And that in itself had proved to be a lesson Trump wasn't used to receiving. Sometimes you couldn't simply win by force of will. Back inside the palace, the events of the day unfolded in the usual whirlwind. Trump met with British officials, exchanged pleasantries, and discussed matters of state. But even as he went through the motions, a part of him kept returning to the guard. It wasn't that he regretted anything that had happened, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized just how significant that moment had been. What was it that had caused him to feel this way? Why had the guard's unmoving stance bothered him so much? Maybe it was because Trump was used to being the one in control. He was used to seeing people react to him, whether positively or negatively, but always with some kind of response. The royal guard, in his silent defiance, had taken the power out of Trump's hands in an instant. He realized that no matter what he said, no matter how loudly he called out, the guard wouldn't be moved, not because of who Trump was, but because of what he represented. The royal guard wasn't just a man in a red uniform. He was part of a long-standing tradition of service and discipline. His role wasn't about personal recognition or even about the individuals he stood in front of. He wasn't there to make people feel important or to acknowledge their commands. He was there to fulfill a duty, to maintain the dignity of the monarchy, and to show the strength of a system that had survived for centuries. Trump found himself fascinated by this. He thought about how many people would have responded to him in a completely different way. Most would have been eager to make an impression, to engage in some sort of conversation, or even to try to entertain him. But the royal guard didn't care about any of that. He wasn't interested in being part of Trump's world. His world was entirely separate, rooted in centuries of tradition and an unwavering commitment to the role he played. And that, Trump realized, was something powerful. As he sat down in a room overlooking the gardens of Buckingham Palace, Trump's thoughts began to turn inward. He had always prided himself on his ability to understand people, to gauge their reactions, and to influence their decisions. But here, in front of the royal guard, he had encountered a wall he couldn't break down, and that was a humbling experience, one that Trump rarely allowed himself to feel. His aides noticed the change in his mood. They were used to Trump's quick decision-making, his fast-paced approach to problems. But now he seemed different, less sure of himself, more reflective. It wasn't the usual Trump they knew. They weren't sure whether to say something or to leave him to his thoughts. As his advisors, they had learned to give him space when he needed it. But this was something new. Trump had always been the one in control of situations, yet now he was processing something that had caught him off guard. The hours passed, and the usual business of state continued. But in the back of his mind, Trump couldn't stop thinking about the guard. He wondered if it was possible for someone to be that committed to their role, that focused on the task at hand, without ever questioning it. Could it really be true that the guard didn't care who he was or what position he held? For Trump, it was hard to wrap his head around. Every part of him had expected to get some sort of rise out of the guard, but he had received nothing. There was no attempt to entertain him, no attempt to impress him, just a complete, unwavering stillness as the day wore on. The encounter with the royal guard began to settle into a kind of lesson, though Trump wouldn't admit it easily. It was clear that for all his experience in the world of politics and business, there were some forces outside of his control. Some things, he realized, weren't meant to be moved by power or influence. Sometimes true strength came in stillness and commitment. By the time the evening rolled around, Trump was preparing to leave the palace. He had one last glance at the grounds outside before heading toward the exit. The royal guard was still there, standing exactly where he had been hours earlier. His posture was perfect, his gaze fixed, unwavering, unmoving. It was as if time had stood still for him, and nothing in the world could change that. As Trump looked at the guard, he found himself admiring the quiet strength the man possessed. He hadn't acknowledged Trump's attempts to engage him, hadn't been swayed by his words or his status. The guard had remained steadfast, as if to show that there were some things in life that were bigger than any one person, no matter how important they might be. Trump turned to leave, but as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter had taught him something valuable. The Royal Guard had won the battle not through force but through resolve. And in that moment, Trump understood that sometimes the greatest power lay not in commanding others but in standing firm, quietly and without hesitation. It was a humbling thought, one that would stay with him long after his visit to Buckingham Palace had ended.